We're live. This is another wonderful episode. We are at number 49, and this is where our brilliant and talented islanders are sharing their skills and stories with island kids of all ages. So welcome. Just wanted to throw in a little information. We are now live. This is another wonderful episode. We are at number 40. See, we are live. There is no lying. Just wanted to let you know that we are now on YouTube, and actually we're doing this live via YouTube today, which is something new and different for us. And that's why we just heard that coming in from somewhere else. We are also on Facebook, so you can find us in either place. Today, I wanted to say thank you to the Family Resource Center and to the San Juan Community Foundation for making this really important episode happening. They're all important, of course. And we have some really fun people coming up. Tomorrow, we have Alice Dean. I know. We have Alice Dean from Master Gardener. She's going to take us on through the demo garden. And then we have Miss Molina coming back for Lap Sit and Linger on Thursday, which is going to be really wonderful. And then we're taking a little break for the holiday weekend. So as I always say, make sure you wear your masks out there. I have a couple of cute ones to show you because I love doing that. And before I say anything else, I want to get us on to our very, very, very special guest today. It's a good one. Get ready for it. Here we go let's see. Oh, my camera is giving me a 3, 2, 1. Oh, there he is. Hi, Thor.
Good morning, Val. Good morning, everybody.
How are you doing?
Just fine here in the garden. Hoping the sun breaks through. That's always good for bees, but we can make do. We can make do for sure.
Well, it sounds like you are. Well, you have a very special collector with you today.
Yes, my son Noah is here off camera doing the bee catching. So we're going to be taking a look at all the bees we can find here this morning in our garden. Noah, did you want to say hi?
Hi. I'm the bee.
And you know, it was so funny. I was just thinking before this, like right before this, we were chatting about, I was saying what a blessing Friday Harbor Live is, because it's put me in contact talking with people who I haven't seen in a long time. And holy cow, it's been a while since we've seen each other.
No, it's absurd. It's been a while since we've seen anyone during this. Oh my gosh, it's great to see you. And I'm really glad you're doing this show.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to be here. But you know what? People want to hear about bees. So anyone listening, if you have any questions for Thor throughout this whole experience, and make sure you tell them a little bit about you because you're kind of amazing. Drop those in the comments, and I will get your questions to him while we're live. Okie doke?
Okay, sounds good. I'm happy to answer any questions. So
take care.
I'm going to take it over from here. Here we go. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Thor Hanson, and I'm a biologist and an author here on lovely San Juan Island. And one of my latest projects, the book that came out just a couple of years ago, was called Buzz, The Nature and Necessity of Bees, which gave me a chance to do a deep dive into one of my favorite topics. And that's what we're going to be covering here today, give you an idea of some of the diversity of bees you can see, even on a cloudy morning in a garden on San Juan Island. So what I want to begin with then is to start out by saying that if you are wearing a stocking cap when you're doing your bee hunting and a down vest and a hoodie, you can quickly narrow down the species and types of bees that you're probably going to be seeing. In this situation, when you see a bee buzz by, chances are it's going to be a bumblebee. And here's one right here that we can take a look at. Shows up pretty well on the camera. That is a beautiful bumblebee in our fauna called Bombus flavifrons, the yellow-fronted bumblebee. And if you take a close look, she has beautiful pollen balls on her hind legs in the pollen baskets there. And I don't know how the color is showing up to you guys in this camera, but I can tell that those pollen balls were gathered at the poppies here in our garden, because those are beautiful purple, like purple leg warmers drawn up over her hind legs. They're absolutely fabulous. And that tells you immediately something about bee evolution that we'll get to in a minute. But the reason you can be confident in that bee identification that you're looking at a bumblebee is that bumblebees have this wonderful ability to detach the wings from the wing muscles and then shiver those muscles, using that energy to warm their bodies up to flight temperature, even on a cool and breezy morning. So that early in the morning or on a cloudy day or early in the springtime or late in the evening, the bees that you're most likely to see flying around here are bumblebees because they can warm themselves up. They have the ability to regulate their body temperature, where so many other bees and insects must rely upon the sun to get up to flight temperature. So we know that we're looking at a bumblebee with this wonderful specimen here. But when we talk about bees, I think it's really important to sort of think broadly and ask some of the most basic questions of all. Really get down to the nitty-gritty about what a bee is in the first place. And if you want to ask that question, you have to catch another kind of insect. And luckily, we had the chance to do so this morning already. If you want to really understand bees, you have to know something about wasps. And here is a beautiful paper wasp. The genus is Polistes. It's Polistes diminulis. This is a European paper wasp. I had to re-enter a password there to get back on screen. I hope I'm still with you. A European paper wasp that's now common all across North America. Quite a mellow creature for a wasp, but they build those lovely little paper nests up in your eaves and so forth. And if you take a look at a paper wasp, or any other wasp really, one of the things you notice is how smooth the body is. How smooth that body is. Hardly any hairs visible. Whereas if you look at our wonderful bumblebee, it immediately jumps out at you that the bee is fuzzy. And that is a key difference between wasps and bees. And the wasps are smooth in part because they don't collect pollen like the bees do. They don't collect pollen. Wasps are inherently hunters. They are scavengers. They are out there collecting bits of meat as they will at your picnic, stealing bologna from your sandwich or fried chicken from the buffet. They are out there scavenging and hunting for spiders and other insects and caterpillars and all sorts of things to take back to the nest and feed to their larvae. They are carnivorous. Now, they will happily sip a bit of nectar from a flower now and then and so forth, but they must have that protein to feed to their developing young. So wasps had been doing this for millions of years before the bees came along. The bees evolved from the wasps, and that's why they so resemble them. They look very similar still, and that's why people confuse the two so often. But the key difference that led bees on their own evolutionary pathway has a lot to do with the pollen that you see on the back legs of these fuzzy bumblebees that we're looking at. Bees set off on their own path by becoming vegetarians. They learn to provision themselves and their offspring solely from the products of flowers, feeding themselves with the sweet nectar, giving them that sugary energy to fly around, and then gathering pollen primarily to feed to their offspring. And pollen then is a nutritious and protein-rich food. And that combination of nectar and pollen and that vegetarian habit led from the wasps that you see here, like our paper wasps, all the way up to the bees like you see with this beautiful bombus flavifrons. Now I'm going to let these insects go right here because they've been in their little tubes long enough and they need to get back to their important work. The wasp needs to go hunting. It's crawling up my screen now. Good. And now this beautiful bee, she needs to go and collect some more pollen. Let's see, there she is. Got to master my webcam technique there. And don't worry, she's not going to sting me. She's just getting organized, recovering from this absurd situation of being stuck in a tube all morning. Well, at least for the last 10 minutes. She's preening herself, cleaning herself off, and getting ready to fly off back over to the flowers, which are just off camera here. So hold on a minute. We'll put her on a bee's friend so she can get some nectar, and she's going to be just fine. So once we've established what bees are and what sets them apart, that tells us immediately something about what we see in a garden like this, that there's a tight and intimate relationship between bees and flowers. And in fact, the evolution of bees and the evolution of flowers is tight and intimate. All of this evolutionary activity took place a long time ago, way back in the Cretaceous period, which was a time famously dominated by those big lumbering beasts, the dinosaurs. But next time you're looking at an image, an artist's recreation of that period, or a movie or whatever, look past those big creatures at the vegetation, and you'll see something interesting. In the mid-Cretaceous, 120, 130 million years ago, there were plenty of conifers, there were seed ferns and other early seed plants, lots of spore plants like ferns and horsetails, but very few flowers. A garden would have looked very different in the mid-Cretaceous because flowering plants were still a rarity, just developing in that landscape. So for an insect to set off on a pathway of provisioning itself solely from the products of flowers was actually a really bold move. That was a risky play, but it worked out beautifully for the bees in that they began to take advantage of the flowering plants just as the flowering plants were arising, and the two began to co-evolve, the bees and the flowering plants, and to drive diversity on both ends. The flowering plants began to diversify, creating all sorts of different blossoms and creating all sorts of different ways to attract bees as pollinators to spread their pollen around. And that has resulted in the great diversity that you see in your backyard, in a garden, in any landscape on Earth. And so that the flowering plants now dominate our flora, whereas it used to be the spore plants and then the early seed plants. Now it's flowering plants that account for the vast majority of species on the planet. And you see that wonderful diversity. When I can see it here. If you could look around with me, you'd be seeing snapdragons and lupins and peas and poppies and a rose bush right behind me. All sorts of diversity, driven in part by that tight relationship between the bees and the flowers. But what is less well understood is how that diversity of flowers in turn drove a great diversity of bees, to the point that we now have more species of bees on this planet than all of the birds and the mammals. You can even throw in some snakes, all of that combined. There are more than 20,000 species of bees on the planet, an incredible diversity. And you can experience quite a lot of that just in the backyard, in your garden here on San Juan Island. So I'm going to grab now another bee or two that Noah has gathered for us. We've got a whole collection that he's bringing in. Let's see what other diversity we have. We can't talk about bees without mentioning the wonderful honeybee. And I wonder if you can see this little individual here if I do that. Ah, there she's coming into focus nicely. And she too has those beautiful pollen baskets filled with pollen, but this is not poppy pollen. I'm not quite sure what she's been after, but they're not purple grains of poppy pollen. She's got something else. Now, this culprit here...
Poppy. I think that's poppy pollen.
Okay, thanks, Noah. And maybe it is poppy pollen. She was visiting a poppy. So this culprit here is one of the reasons why when we think about bees, we don't think of diversity. We are so accustomed to thinking about our beautiful honeybee, the one bee that has been extensively domesticated for thousands of years around the world. We domesticated this honeybee before people domesticated ducks or horses, before we developed crops like apples or even coffee. Wonderful coffee came to us after the honeybee, and there's a very good reason for that. Honeybees we're familiar with because of their namesake product, the honey, which we still enjoy stirring into our tea. But in the ancient world, that was the sweetest thing in the human diet. For millennia, you couldn't get anything better than honey for sweetness, way before refined sugar. So really until fairly recently, honey was the sweetest thing we had. And beyond that, bees provided a huge array of other products to us in that time. It was an incredible source of wax that was used for everything from the cleanest burning light in the ancient world, from beeswax candles, to the world's first erasable writing tablet. The first iPad, if you will, was a writing tablet made of beeswax where you could scratch in your letters and then heat it up to erase those letters and then use it over and over and over again. The first writing tablet, again, a product of bees. Beeswax used in all sorts of other things in the ancient world. So many times the wax was even more valuable than the honey itself. So when we get this sweetness and light from a creature, it becomes very dear to us. And it's not surprising then to know that beekeeping as an art and a hobby and an industry really dates back at least to the middle period of Egypt, where there are fine relics of artwork on some of the walls of the tombs and the buildings there, showing very sophisticated clay hives that were ferried up and down the River Nile in time with the blooming of seasonal wildflowers and crops. So it's a very ancient connection that we have with this wonderful honeybee. And we're going to let her go now, too. And there she goes. But that focus on one species has obscured to us the great diversity of other bees that we find in the landscape. Now let's see if Noah has another. Do you have any other bombus species for us?
Well, here's a flavifrons.
Okay. We're looking for some other species, but it might interest you to know that we have at least a dozen species of bumblebees alone here on San Juan Island. The one we're catching here this morning, the yellow-fronted bumblebee, or yellow-shouldered in some books, is a wonderful bee that comes out early in the springtime.
You can hold that in your hand.
Oh, Noah's got a good find for us here. This is the Bombus flavifrons drone. And I don't know if any of you, we're going to leap here, make a literary leap to an author called P.G. Wodehouse, or Wodehouse, if you will, a British author who wrote about Jeeves and Wooster, Bertie Wooster being this sort of layabout, wealthy young man in Edwardian England, and Jeeves being his brilliant valet or butler sort of person who would get him out of all sorts of crazy jams. Comical books, very funny. And this layabout, wealthy young man was the member of a social club, which apparently was quite common in the upper crust in Britain at the time. And I don't know if Wodehouse was a beekeeper or knew anything about bees, but it would indicate that he knew something, because he called that social club all these layabout young men who didn't do much of anything. He called it the Drones Club. And that is the drone bumblebee, or the drone honeybee to a T. And here's a drone here. This is a drone flavifrons. These are freeloaders. The drones in the bee kingdom really have only one purpose. They are there for reproduction. And very little else. They do not gather pollen. They do not gather nectar, except maybe to feed themselves. They don't really contribute to the colony itself. They are layabouts, and they are living off the industry of the female bees that do most of the work in those societies. So he was spot on by calling those lazy young males the drones. And I think Noah is going to demonstrate one of our favorite tricks that you can get away with. Okay, you can hold drones in your hand. Hold your hands right up by the camera, Noah, and then you can let the drone out. Whoop, right in the hand. Nope, there he goes. And he flies right away. Perfectly harmless. Perfectly harmless, because drones give us an insight into another very famous aspect of bee biology, and that is the evolution of the stinger. Drones cannot possibly sting you because they don't have the equipment. The stinger of bees and of wasps evolved from what entomologists call the ovipositor, the egg-laying device of the insect. And so because the males do not lay eggs, they don't have the equipment to have evolved a stinger in the first place. So you can always, if you learn to recognize a drone, hold one safely in your hand and feel that wonderful rustle of their wings and the buzzing right there close by, perfectly harmless. It is the female bees of all species that have the stinger, have the apparatus to sting. Some of the bees have lost the impulse to sting entirely. It's usually these highly social bees, like the honeybee that we're so familiar with, living in their hives of thousands, or the bumblebees, which live in smaller nests of maybe several hundred. Those bees that have a lot to defend tend to be the ones with the strongest stings. But they're really the exception in the bee world, in that the vast majority of bees are solitary bees. They live on their own, a single female provisioning one tiny nest, gathering enough nectar and pollen to feed just half a dozen offspring perhaps in the nest, maybe build one or two nests over the course of the season. They live a very different lifestyle, and because they're solitary and they don't have a huge colony and a bunch of honey to protect, their stings in some cases are non-existent or are very mild, and they're quite reluctant to sting. They would much rather flee from you than sting to defend this tiny nest that's not worth the effort to defend. So it tells us a lot when we can hold a drone in our hand. We learn immediately about the evolution and the biology of one of those famous bee traits, the sting. And it also alerts us to the fact that bees really, they have sort of bad PR in that regard. We tend to confuse those bees and wasps, but I will tell you right now, on San Juan Island, the majority of stings that are experienced by any of us are the product of wasps. Those social wasps, like the paper wasp that we saw earlier, which is a fairly mellow species, or our several species of native yellow jackets. Also a highly social wasp that build totally enclosed paper nests that you see hanging from the eaves or buried in the ground. You see ground nesting wasps as well. So a great variety of these paper wasps, and they are the most aggressive social insects in our flora. The hornets, even including the dreaded murder hornet that we have heard of now, hasn't been sighted in San Juan County yet, hasn't gotten closer than Blaine, and hopefully they won't get established. That's an Asian insect that recently invaded here and is a predator of honeybees and other social insects. So a great mouthful about bees already, and we still are looking at only a couple of species that we found. But we have some tubes set up over some of our ground nesting bees over here, and we're hopeful that we might be able to get one of those before our time is up today, because we have a huge variety of other bees in the fauna here in the garden as well, from mining bees to leafcutter bees to mason bees.
This is what the ground nesting bee looks like.
Oh, God, right on target. Noah has a beautiful ground nester for us. And in fact, what's interesting is this is a ground nesting wasp. Nice call, Noah. This is one we didn't even expect to get today. But
those are the only thing nesting in the ground.
you see immediately that it's quite tiny. Look at the size of that compared to my finger, and compare it to, the size of one of these bumblebees. It's a tiny insect, and you see great diversity in size in the bees as well, but this is a tiny ground nesting wasp. Again, a solitary wasp, very mellow, unlikely to sting or anything to that effect, but because it's a wasp, we know that that would be a hunter as well. Let's see if we can get her up to the camera. There she is, just getting herself organized on my palm there. We'll let her fly off again. So she would be a hunter out scavenging probably some little tiny caterpillars from the garden here. So good to have wasps in your garden as well as bees. The bees will be taking care of the pollination, and many of these wasps will be gathering up a lot of garden pests that would otherwise be disturbing your fruits and vegetables. Now let's see what else we have in our tubes lining up here. The main bee we seem to have flying is the Bombus flavifrons, but we'll see if we can find anything else coming up shortly. There's another trick about bees that I'll show you now that Noah and I enjoy. This is when you really want to nerd out on bees. You can learn to appreciate their smell. And they often have a very distinctive smell that is a combination not only of the flowers that they may have been visiting and some residual scent from the flowers or the pollen, but it has to do with how bees communicate. Bees, if you think about it, these social bees particularly, communicate a lot by scent, because when you're inside a hive or a nest full of insects, I mean, you can imagine it like being in a dark room full of people and you're bumping into all these people all the time, can't see a bloody thing. Hard to keep your social distance inside a beehive. So the way that you communicate, since you can't really see, you can do a bit with sound, but what you do is produce smells. You produce what they call pheromones, these chemical signatures that communicate amongst the bees. And it is, in fact, pheromones that allow the queen bee to direct the activity of the hive, to suppress the reproductive instincts of her daughters so they will stick around next to her, helping with the activity of the nest rather than reproducing and carrying on their own. Now we're going to let this another beautiful bee up to the camera here. Again, with that beautiful purple pollen on her hind legs. And you can see that they're really in a ball. And she mixes the pollen with a bit of nectar, makes it sticky, and then rubs it on those legs in really dedicated little pollen baskets. And that is a habit that is exclusive to a particular group of bees, related bees, the honeybees, the bumblebees, they call the corbiculate bees. They're all closely related. I have to enter a password here. Hold on. There, now I'm back on camera. Those corbiculate bees have those pollen baskets on their hind legs, but it's certainly not the only way that bees have evolved to carry pollen. There are leafcutter bees that carry pollen on their bellies. Mason bees belong to the leafcutter family. If you have mason bees and you watch them, you'll notice them coming in as if they're wearing an apron of pollen. They have hairs on their bellies for carrying pollen. There are bees that carry the pollen on the legs, but not in a basket. They have long hairs, really looking like leg warmers all the way up the legs. Many of our mining bees have that type of pollen carrying capacity. And then there are a few bees, not many in our fauna, but a few that carry pollen inside. They eat the pollen, put it in their mouths or into just carry it really in the mouth, not too much farther down that, and then regurgitate the pollen when they get back to the nest. So there are a variety of ways that bees will carry pollen as well. And I'm hoping we might have another species or two to show you this morning, but I think being a cloudy, windy morning, it probably is going to be dedicated mostly to this common bumblebee that we have already seen. So at that point, having talked to you now for nearly half an hour about bees, and don't get me started, I could go all day, but I wonder if there are any questions, or if Val has any questions that I can answer for you at this point. Oh, there she is. Val, I'm not getting your audio, and I'm not sure if others are.
You're so right. It helps if I turn on my mic.
Oh, there
So I have to tell you that as I'm watching, I just absolutely love this. And one of the things I'm wondering about is you're so gentle and with these bees and allowing them to like climb. Like that completely breaks what we've been brainwashed to do around bees, because we're used to like, if there's a bee, you do this, right?
Sure.
And try to get it away. And I love that you're teaching us that we can have a gentle demeanor around bees.
Yeah, well, I think it's, we're so fearful of the stings, but again, the sting is really the rare experience interacting with bees or other stinging insects, if you will. Most of them do so only, as a last resort, as a defense of, their nesting situation, particularly those highly social bees and wasps that we were talking about earlier. So one of the things that I really enjoy about learning biology and learning the details of the lives of insects and other creatures is that it informs us in how we can behave around them. And if you know what to expect from them, you can be much more comfortable in how you interact. And one of the most common questions that I am ever asked when I talk about bees is how often I've been stung. And I can tell you that since I began really studying bees in earnest, I could count the number of stings probably on, I would say, 2 fingers. And the first was a bumblebee that stung me, but you have to, allow her some leeway in this situation because she was inside my gumboot when I came out from the office, and it was a cold spring day, and I put on my boot and got a big wallop, big sting right on my big toe. And of course, this does not stand alone because it also has a biological lesson. If you leave your rain boots out on the porch in the early springtime, when bumblebee queens are just emerging from hibernation and looking for a place to build a nest, and they see this wonderful empty boot, it looks like a pretty good spot. So I not only had a sore toe, but I was able to learn quite a lot about what bumblebee queens are looking for when they are setting about trying to find a nest. So Noah and I are always trying to get bumblebee queens to nest where we want them to. And we did have a little bit of preliminary success by attaching an old boot to the nest box that we wanted them to nest in. And we did see a queen go right into that boot and explore the box. So a good lesson there to be learned. And the second one was in a situation where I was catching bees and holding them against my hand, and I mistakenly pinned a tiny little sweat bee against my hand with the tube that I was trying to release her with. And of course, she stung me. But being stung by a sweat bee is sort of like, I don't know, maybe jabbing yourself very gently with a fork. It wasn't much of a sting at all, but the bee was, smaller than my pinky nail, and she didn't have a lot of juice, but she gave me everything she had. In all of these years. And in each case, it teaches us something about the biology of the species.
Well, and I'm also wondering, I mentioned the boot thing, in that, because I was actually going to say, you just need to put a boot next to where you want them to nest. But it's so, like you mentioned earlier about the olfactory, right?
Yes.
Yes. So there's something.
Oh, yeah, they're very fragrant. Noah and I have determined that certain bees have different scents, and that has been backed up by. There's a wonderful. Well, he passed away just a year or so ago. Robin Thorpe, wonderful, probably the expert on bumblebees in Western North America, and I was out in the field with him, and he was catching different scents, from different bees, particularly the males. Early on, I was out in the field with him. And it took me a while to figure out what he was talking about. But Noah and I are now quite sure that we can recognize at least the distinctive odor of Bombus vosnesenskii, which is a common bee here on San Juan Island. You will see these big black bumblebees with one yellow stripe on the abdomen and a bright yellow face. That's the yellow-faced bumblebee, vosnesenskii. And that one we're pretty sure has a very distinctive sort of flowery, peppery odor that is left behind in the tube when we release them.
That's so cool. And as our viewers might be interested in capturing their own bees for observation, I think a big piece of this is that we don't injure the bee, right?
Yes. So you catch, what we do to catch a bee, we call it bee tubing. We get a little plastic tube like this with a lid, and approach the bee gently when it's on a flower and distracted, and you capture it in the tube. Got one here that we'll let go. And then what you want to remember is that the bee can be there in the tube for several minutes unharmed, but you don't want to keep it in the tube for too long, and you don't want to leave the tubes in direct sunlight where they would overheat. So you keep your bees. I've got mine lined up here underneath this cement block that I've got the computer resting on. You keep them out of the sun, and you don't keep them for very long. And then when you release them, you can either just open the tube and shake gently, and they come right out. Or if you're feeling bold, you can put them in the palm of your hand. And it's extremely safe. They if that what they're really thinking about is getting away, or might take them a minute to warm up and get organized and preen their antennae and so forth. But they're really not even aware of the fact that they're sitting on your palm. They're just on a nice warm place, and they'll fly away.
That's super cool. I love it. And I have to tell you, I got completely in doing some background research for the show. I was listening to several of your talks that are available on YouTube, and started getting, like, I have 1,000 questions for you about, in one of the talks you started talking about the evolution of man over time and the increase in brain size due to an increased access to glucose, thanks to our bees.
Oh yeah, this is a wonderful story. It's a bit of sort of a combination of biology and anthropology, and one of the key players in the story is a woman named Elissa Crittenden, who is a nutritional anthropologist based at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and she has been studying the Hadza people in Tanzania for decades now, and exploring how they interact with their environment. They are one of the few people that are living a traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle in East Africa, in the very landscape where our species is thought to have evolved. So if you want to know about how hunting and gathering influences behavior and evolution, that's a pretty good place to look. So she has made great contacts over there. Ooh, and I have to interrupt myself by saying we are officially going from stocking cap to sun cap, which is always a good sign for your bee collecting day. So I think we'll probably get some more bees here any minute. But what Elissa thought to ask was, how much honey do people eat, right? Because she knows that they were out there collecting honey. But she was the first person to ask, how much do people actually eat? And when she started interviewing people, she learned that the people in that community don't just look for honey on occasionally or seasonally. They search for honey every single day. They look for it not only from honeybees, but from at least 6 other honey-making species in that environment. And it's everyone's favorite food. It is something they're passionate about. And when you add up all the calories just from the honey, not even from the larvae and the pollen, which they also eat, it comprises fully 15% of the calories in the Hadza diet. So it is a major food source. But it is a food source that if you start thinking from an evolutionary perspective, from an anthropological perspective, it's one that does not leave behind any kind of archaeological evidence. You don't see a spear point or a stone tool, you're not crushing it, you're not doing anything to it other than eating it. So it is something that has been missed, in her opinion, and now shared by many other anthropologists, that the calories that we have gained from our sweet tooth, our primordial sweet tooth, our interest in bees, our ability to follow them to their nests and raid the honey, is something that contributed to our own evolution. Because if you look at the story of human evolution, and we've all probably seen these images in some textbook, the human ancestral story is often depicted as a story of brain size. You see this row of skulls, and the skulls get bigger over time. And what that is linked to is an increase in brain size, right? We're very large-brained for really any species, but the brain is what a physiologist would call metabolically expensive tissue. It takes a lot of energy to run a brain. So if you want to evolve a larger brain size, you have to have more calories to fuel that larger brain. Our brains take up only 2-3% of our body weight, but they consume as much as 20% of our daily energy use, right? So it takes a lot of fuel to run the brain. And over time, any increase in brain size, sizable increase over that evolutionary story, has always been theoretically associated with some change in behavior that was associated with more calories. And whether that was hunting, stone tools, the advent of fire, cooperation, all of these things could lead to larger brain size. And now Elissa and many other anthropologists believe that honey, that our interest in bees, deserves a seat at that table, because there's no other source of concentrated calories in the environment that equals honey. What's
Yeah.
more, it comes in the form of glucose, and the brain is an obligate glucose consumer. It must have glucose. If you eat a tuna fish sandwich, your body will turn the tuna fish sandwich into glucose to feed your brain. You can go straight to the source with honey. One-stop shopping. So it's a wonderful story and an example of how our relationship with nature drives our own evolution. In the very same way that we see, this coevolution between other things like bees and plants and so forth. Well, there's very strong evidence now that our interest in bees has changed us.
Another thing that I loved that you mentioned that was so good. I love all this. It's so good. The other thing that I had a question about, or that I listened to you say that I thought was really interesting, was that you mentioned about how like every third bite of food that we have is influenced by bees. And then you mentioned a little ditty from the 80s that we know, maybe 90s even. 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun.
Right. Yes. No, this was a highly scientific project. And since it's a Friday Harbor Crowd, I will tell you that to pursue this piece of research, I took my bike on the ferry, got off in Anacortes, and rode my bicycle to downtown Anacortes, which is the closest McDonald's to San Juan Island, because I wanted to explore the influence of bees in our diet in a way that we wouldn't necessarily think about. If you go into the grocery aisle or the produce aisle in the grocery store down at King's or Marketplace, you're surrounded by fruits and vegetables, and the connection to bees is more or less intuitive. You can see that pollination was involved in the creation of this apple or the pears or the melons lying there. You get a sense that these things came from your garden and bees may have been involved. But what about a food that you would never think about in terms of pollination? What could be better than a Big Mac? And since I already knew the recipe from that silly old commercial that we grew up with, I thought, well, let's see about all those ingredients and what would you have left to eat if you took out all of the ingredients that had to do with bees, that relied upon bees in one way or another, for pollination, for crop development, all sorts of things. If we took those bees out of the equation, what would we have left from the Big Mac? So I sat down there. I had the Big Mac in front of me, and I got a table. I had forceps, these big tweezers. I had my notebooks, I had my reference books. And I sat there in McDonald's and dissected a Big Mac. And I can tell you, I got a lot of crazy looks from people at the next table thinking I was a little bit off my rocker. But nonetheless, it was fascinating. I made a pile of things that were bee-related and a pile of things that were not bee-related. And in the end, the vast majority of ingredients, even in that Big Mac, would relied upon bees in one way or another. Whether it was the pickles, whether it was the which had soybeans in it. You start to get into this stuff. There are, just even the, paprika in the special sauce, all of these things that had bee activity involved. And what I ended up with at the end was the 2 all beef patties remained, because a cow can sit there and eat grass and make all beef patties. Although beef cows are fed all sorts of things besides grass, but you can feed a beef cow on grass. And once I had picked I think it was something like 290 sesame seeds off of the sesame seed bun. I had the bun and the 2 all beef patties, and pretty much everything else in the sandwich was gone. So what I learned from that was that, yes, we could have food in a world without bees, but it would be extremely boring.
Yeah, without a doubt. No, I loved that when I heard that in there. So thank you for sharing it here as well. So did Noah catch any more?
Yeah, I think we've got another species. Again, we're heavy on Bumblebee.
Jump out so you can get a better camera.
Oh, that one got away.
Which one?
The was it a Sitkensis?
Yeah, that was a Sitkensis. Or maybe a Mixtus.
It might have been a Mixtus. I'm not sure. At any rate, we've got. Not even sure what that one is. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, that's in focus now. think you might have caught a Rufo. There's a bumblebee in our fauna called Bombus Rufus Sanctus that comes in a huge variety of color patterns. And it has, where most bumblebees have a really long face, it has a face that's almost more oval, almost like a lima bean or something shape. And this one seems to have that facial pattern. And Rufus Sanctus comes in a huge variety of colors. So there are some bumblebees that we have that you can tell in a heartbeat from their color pattern. Others that come in different patterns, and you need to look at other features. This might be a Rufus Sanctus, which is interesting because it's about the time of year we start to see them. They come out later in the season than many of our other bumblebees. So we'll let her fly away. If she can get up there. There she is. In focus. Good. And she's going to enjoy this sunshine like we all are. She's organizing her pollen load. And you'll probably see her preen her antennae a little bit as well. And that's a very important part of the preening process for any bee or other insects as well, because the antennae are really, they're a lot more than just, well, we used to call them feelers as a kid. And then somewhere in my biological training, I was told to call them antennae, which is the accurate term. But feelers is actually a pretty good way to describe them because they are filled with sensory organs. That's how the bee smells. It's how the bee, they're very sensitive to touch. They can tell wind direction, air pressure, all sorts of organs on those antennae that help the bee navigate and interact with her world. So there she goes right now, organizing the feelers, if you will, before taking flight. Now give her a nudge. Oh, she just likes hanging out on my hand. Well, there she goes. So yes, a marvelous bit of additional diversity here. And if the sun stays out, we could probably rack up all kinds of bee species because I don't know. We don't have a full list for the San Juan Islands on how many bees, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 150, 200 different species of bees that we would have a chance of seeing on a bee quest here. Yes, just here. We have 20,000 in the world. There are 3,000 to 4,000 in North America. The bee diversity here in the San Juans is pretty good, but we don't have a list. We don't have a list yet of how many. But certainly, we would be in that realm.
I am totally blown away by that number. When I think of high diversity here, I'm thinking about our birds. I'm thinking about, so that's amazing.
Yeah,
and so much to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that there's plenty to do. You can, if you are tiring of your warblers, you can start looking at bees and be highly entertained by great diversity. Noah caught another one of these burrowing wasps.
Oh, I'll jump out.
A slightly larger version. We found a neat wasp earlier this year called a potter wasp that nests in the ground but builds a little turret at the entrance to the nest, and you can see that it's made out of little globs of mud, thus the potter part of it that has been sculpted into a beautiful turret. This is not a potter wasp, it's something else, but nonetheless a ground nesting wasp that's very busy here in the garden, so I don't know quite what they're eating, but we'll let her get back to it.
Well, thank you to Noah for being an exceptional of the bees.
Scavenger. He's an excellent bee catcher.
I really appreciate that. And for everybody listening, this is like literally just the tip of the iceberg. As much as I know you've learned today, you have to get Taurus Buzz, The Nature and Necessity of Bees. So you can get it at our beloved bookstore here through Griffin Bay. And he also has seeds and feathers. And as engaging as you are on camera, you are as an author as well, I have to say. It's I love reading your writing. So maybe we could talk you into talking about seeds or feathers sometime too.
Absolutely. It's all right here in the garden.
It is. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And hold tight right there. I'll be right back to you. But thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Bye, everybody.
And and Larry White just said, thank you, Tor, for being here today. And yes, thank you. That was amazing. And thank you to the Family Resource Center and San Juan Community Foundation for making this amazing episode happen so that we could learn more about all of the species of bees that live here in the San Juan Islands. Tomorrow, join me with Alice Dean, and then Miss Melina will be here on Thursday, and we'll see you later. Be safe, keep learning, keep listening.